At the barbecue, my cousin scoffed. So you just push papers for the army? I smiled. No, I fly. He smirked. Oh yeah? What's your call sign? I said, Iron Widow. His Navy SEAL father went silent. He knew exactly who I was. Imagine dedicating your life to a demanding profession, excelling in a world few ever witness, only to be persistently underestimated by the very people who claim to know you best. My name is Cassandra Reed, and for years, my family saw me as nothing more than the quiet one, who eventually went off to do something. But what if a casual, dismissive comment at a routine family cookout could unravel that entire illusion, forcing everyone to confront a truth far more profound than they ever anticipated? Have you ever had to fight to be truly seen by your own flesh and blood? I grew up in a quaint, tight-knit community along the Virginia coast. Our lives were a tapestry woven with backyard gatherings, birthday celebrations, and the comforting rhythm of familiar surroundings. My cousin, Jake Miller, was perpetually the center of attention, boisterous, athletic, and brimming with an almost theatrical self-assurance. His father, my Uncle John, was a retired Navy admiral, a man whose quiet demeanor naturally commanded respect. As a child, I harbored immense admiration for Uncle John, secretly hoping to one day earn his pride. When I announced my decision to join the Air Force, most of my relatives brushed it off as a passing phase. They chuckled, labeling me too delicate or too methodical for military life. I never bothered to correct their assumptions. Instead, I poured my energy into my studies, dedicating countless hours to flight simulators, and pushing myself through rigorous training. By my late 20s, I was a seasoned Air Force captain, a pilot with multiple deployments under my belt, and a call sign that perfectly encapsulated my unwavering fortitude, Steel Sentinel. Family gatherings, however, remained a stubbornly consistent fixture. They were a predictable blend of familiar faces, comforting dishes, and thinly veiled condescension from those who'd rarely ventured beyond our hometown. Jake's taunts, usually aimed at my seemingly boring career, used to simply wash over me. Our backyard, a perennial stage for these get-togethers, felt frozen in time. The weathered stone patio, the ancient grill my father had owned for decades, children's gleeful shouts as they dodged sprinklers, it all radiated a familiar warmth. My mother, a maestro of macaroni salad and coleslaw, would meticulously arrange the spread in plastic containers with lids that never quite sealed properly. My father, an engineer who'd spent 30 years developing defense systems, would stand by the grill, a cold beer in hand, nodding absently as various uncles spun their tales. He was proud of me, I knew, though he rarely articulated it. A silent squeeze of my shoulder during my leaves, a murmured inquiry about my diet, was his understated way of showing affection. Jake's mother, my Aunt Brenda, maintained a perpetual hostess smile, the kind that effortlessly smoothed over any awkwardness. She'd embrace me tightly upon my return, exclaiming, "Look at you, all grown up," as if I were still a gangly preteen. They all meant well, I suppose. Jake had transformed into a stranger. As a boy, he'd been playfully reckless. We'd climbed trees, raced bikes, and skipped stones across the creek. He idolized his father, as many children of military parents do. Yet somewhere along the way, that admiration soured. He began wearing his father's legacy like an ill-fitting costume, too large, never quite authentic. By the time I enlisted, Jake had already dropped out of community college, working at a local gym and spouting cliches about discipline and mental fortitude, as if he'd invented them. Family dinners were often punctuated by his pronouncements on pushing through pain, and everyone would nod along, granting him an authority he hadn't truly earned. Meanwhile, I was at Lackland Air Force Base, pushing my body to its absolute limits, learning to command aircraft that cost more than every house on our street combined. I didn't broadcast my struggles or achievements, not out of shame, but because the work itself was my most profound statement. After my first deployment, my uniform still carried the faint scent of jet fuel and desert dust. I'd flown countless close air support missions out of a forward operating base, enduring long, grueling hours in the cockpit, eyes constantly scanning for threats, coordinating with ground units, ensuring our troops returned safely. It was far from glamorous. It was exacting, exhausting, and utterly vital. Jake caught sight of my uniform and smirked. "You look tired," he quipped. "Rough day at the paper-pushing department?" The room fell silent. My mother's smile flickered. My father's beer clattered a little too loudly onto the table. Uncle John, who'd been engrossed in a conversation, glanced my way. His expression remained inscrutable, but I detected a fleeting flicker, perhaps of recognition, perhaps of apology. He said nothing to his son. I brushed it off with a laugh, something like that. It was then I grasped the depth of the imbalance. Jake needed to be the tough one, the military-adjacent figure, the one respected by association. And I was just the quiet girl who flew planes. No one asked what that truly entailed. No one seemed to care. I'd earned my wings at 23, after a year of brutal training that decimated over half my class. Flight school wasn't about raw courage. It was about unwavering precision, calm under duress, the ability to make split-second decisions when lives hung in the balance. I wasn't the most naturally gifted pilot, but I was consistently steady. I didn't panic, didn't freeze. When instructors pushed us to our breaking point, I pushed back harder. My call sign came later, during my second deployment. Call signs aren't chosen. They're bestowed by your squadron, often after an unforgettable act, sometimes embarrassing, sometimes legendary. Mine was forged during a night mission in Helmand Province, a mission I still don't discuss at family gatherings. We were providing air support for a SEAL reconnaissance team that had been ambushed, pinned down in a valley. The extraction route was a death trap, enemy fire erupting from every ridge, RPGs streaking through the night sky. The initial extraction helicopter was hit and forced to retreat. The team was stranded, taking casualties, ammo dwindling. Command scrambled for options. I was circling overhead in my A-10 Warthog, dangerously low on fuel, well past my return to base point. My wingman, Lieutenant Ben Hawk Davies, urged me to break off. Sentinel, we're running on fumes. We have to go. I looked at the coordinates, at the thermal images of our desperate comrades below, and made a choice. Negative. I'm making a pass. I dropped lower than protocol advised and unleashed everything I had on the enemy positions. 30mm cannon fire, a relentless torrent delivered with the muscle memory of thousands of hours of training. I carved a path, clearing the corridor just long enough for the backup helicopter to swoop in and rescue every single SEAL. When I landed back at base, my aircraft bore the scars of enemy fire. Not enough to bring me down, but enough to earn a significant look from the maintenance crew. My squadron commander offered no reprimand. He simply nodded and walked away. 2 days later, the call sign was official: Steel Sentinel. The pilot who never abandoned those in need. Uncle John knew that story. He'd served with some of those SEALs. He understood the profound gravity of a pilot diving into a hot zone to extract a team. But he never told Jake. And Jake never asked. He simply continued to expound on discipline and toughness, concepts he'd never truly experienced. I didn't harbor resentment, not deeply. Resentment is a draining emotion, and I was too focused on flying, training, and leading. But I did observe the pattern. Every family gathering, every holiday, every cookout, Jake found a way to belittle my accomplishments. It was never overtly hostile, just casually dismissive. Oh, Cassie's home. How's the office job? Or must be nice flying a desk. And each time the family would offer an uncomfortable, polite chuckle, unwilling to intervene. My mother would hastily change the subject. My father would clear his throat. Uncle John would regard me with that same unreadable gaze, leaving me to wonder if he expected me to defend myself, or if he believed I shouldn't have to. I convinced myself it didn't matter. I had my work, my squadron, the respect of those who understood. That should have been enough. Most days it was. The older Jake got, the more he clung to his father's achievements. He boasted about military rigor he'd never known and dismissed my career as mere paperwork. Returning home from a tough deployment in Kandahar, he again delivered his tired line. You look tired. Rough day with the filing cabinets at HQ. I laughed it off even as the room fell quiet. Uncle John offered a subtle nod, perhaps of respect, perhaps apology, but remained silent. The imbalance intensified. Every family event became a low-grade performance. Jake, the loud civilian hero, me, the quiet professional who probably just filed flight plans. No one corrected him. I didn't need their validation, I told myself. The peculiar advantage of being underestimated is the space it grants you. Those who don't take you seriously rarely scrutinize you closely. They don't ask probing questions. They don't notice the profound transformations you undergo, the growth that shapes you into someone they wouldn't recognize if they truly looked. I was 29 when I returned from Kandahar. That deployment had been different, longer, harsher, infinitely more complex. We'd flown missions supporting ground operations, delivering close air support for convoys, conducting reconnaissance for special operations teams, and providing medevac cover when situations spiraled. I'd logged over 200 combat hours in 6 months. My squadron commander had nominated me for an accommodation. I kept quiet about it at home. Jake was 31 then, still working at the gym, still residing in the same apartment he'd moved into after leaving his parents' house. He had a girlfriend, Sarah, who seemed pleasant enough, though she always appeared slightly weary at family gatherings, as if she'd endured all of Jake's anecdotes twice over. At this particular dinner, Aunt Brenda had prepared her famous lasagna. The house was fragrant with garlic and tomato, and my younger cousins were running riot, their shouts echoing through the living room. My mother was assisting in the kitchen while my father was out back with Uncle John, discussing naval architecture. I had just arrived, still in my civilian clothes, jeans and a simple blouse, nothing to betray that I'd spent the last 6 months in a war zone. Jake spotted me first. "Cassie, how's the Air Force treating you?" I set my bag down by the door. "Good. Busy." He grinned, that same easy magnetic grin that captivated people, even when he was being insufferable. "Yeah, I bet. Filing reports, scheduling flights." I could have corrected him. I could have detailed the mission where we'd provided cover for a medevac under heavy fire, or the night I'd flown perilously low to divert enemy attention from a beleaguered convoy. I could have mentioned the commendation, the pending early promotion to major. But I didn't. The truth was, I didn't owe him an explanation. "Something like that," I replied. He laughed, joined by a few other relatives, their polite, awkward chuckles filling the void. My mother emerged from the doorway, wiping her hands on a dish towel, and offered me a look that silently urged, "Let it go." So I did. I let it go as I always had. But something shifted that night. Perhaps it was the bone-deep exhaustion. Or perhaps the sudden realization that I'd allowed this charade to persist for years. I'd been so fixated on proving myself where it truly mattered, in the cockpit with my squadron in combat, that I'd neglected to set the record straight at home. And that silence had enabled Jake to construct his own narrative. One where I was merely a paper-pushing pilot, and he was the sole authority on true grit. After dinner, I found Uncle John on the back porch, gazing out at the yard, a beer in his hand. He acknowledged me with a glance, and for a moment neither of us spoke. "Heard you did good work in Kandahar," he finally said. I shrugged. "Just doing my job." He nodded slowly, clearly choosing his words with care. "Jake. He doesn't mean anything by it, you know. He's just trying to find his place." I met his gaze then, truly looking at Uncle John, a man who'd devoted 25 years to the Navy, who'd led teams into the planet's most treacherous locales, who'd earned every shred of respect he commanded. And here he was, excusing his son. "I know," I said. "But he doesn't get to define my place." He didn't reply, but a subtle change crossed his expression. A flicker of recognition, perhaps even approval. He raised his beer in a small, silent toast and I nodded back. The next family gathering was a 4th of July cookout. Same backyard, same grill, same relatives. Jake was there with Sarah, loudly expounding on a new training program he was developing. Something about functional fitness and mental resilience. I was by the cooler pulling out a soda when he turned to me. "So, Cassie, ever think about doing something more hands-on? I mean, flying's cool and all, but it's not like you're really in the thick of it, you know?" I popped the tab on my soda and took a slow sip, allowing the silence to lengthen. My father, who'd been diligently flipping burgers, froze. My mother's conversation with Aunt Brenda faltered. Uncle John across the patio subtly turned his head, watching. I met Jake's eyes. "I am in the thick of it, Jake. That's the part you don't understand." He blinked, taken aback by my directness. "I didn't mean, I know what you meant," I interrupted. "And I'm telling you you're wrong." The ensuing silence was unlike the usual awkward lulls. This one was heavy, charged with meaning. My father returned to the grill, a faint smile playing on his lips. My mother offered a small, approving nod. And Uncle John? He subtly raised his beer again, that same quiet toast. Jake didn't press the issue. He changed the subject, rambling about something else, but the dynamic had fundamentally shifted. For the first time I had drawn a line and everyone had witnessed it. I didn't need to explain myself, didn't need to validate my career or my choices. But I also didn't need to allow someone else's insecurity to define me. That was the lesson I'd been painstakingly learning over years of deployments and family gatherings. Self-respect isn't demanded, it's claimed, and sometimes, it's claimed by simply living your truth. Jake and I didn't converse much for the remainder of that summer. Not out of anger, but from a newfound, unspoken understanding. He had constructed his identity around the idea of toughness. I had built mine around embodying it. We were never going to see eye to eye, and that was finally okay. I had my life, he had his, and the family was at last starting to perceive the distinction. The true turning point came later that summer. Red plastic cups, kids playing tag, classic rock humming in the background. Jake was in full showman mode, regaling a cluster of younger cousins and neighbors with exaggerated tales of his training. It was late August, the kind of humid Virginia afternoon where the air hung thick and heavy. My father had fired up the grill early, and by noon the backyard buzzed with aunts, uncles, and cousins who were practically family. I'd been home for 3 days, a brief reprieve between training cycles. I was 31, still a captain, but the promotion board results were imminent. My squadron commander had recommended me for major, and if the board concurred, I'd pin on the oak leaves by my next birthday. I hadn't breathed a word of it to anyone. It felt like tempting fate. I was at the grill assisting my father with the burgers. He'd stepped inside for more propane, leaving me to manage the sizzling patties. Jake's voice sliced through the chatter. "So, you just file paperwork for the Air Force?" He grinned, that same easy, performative grin. He craved a reaction, eager to be the witty one who could tease his accomplished cousin because, well, it was all in good fun, right? I slowly wiped my hands on a napkin. "No," I said, my voice steady. "I fly." He laughed, and a few onlookers joined in, uncertain. "Oh yeah? What's your call sign then?" The question hung in the air. Call signs are alien to most civilians. They imagine them as cool nicknames chosen at whim. They don't grasp that a call sign is a badge of honor forged in action bestowed by comrades. And they certainly don't comprehend that some call signs carry a weight that transcends the squadron. I met his eyes. Steel Sentinel. The name landed like a sudden drop in atmospheric pressure before a storm. The laughter evaporated. A few people exchanged confused glances. Uncle John, who'd been jovially chatting with my father and some uncles near the cooler, became utterly motionless. He turned slowly, his gaze locking onto mine with an intensity one rarely saw outside of formal military settings. For a long moment he simply stared, mentally sifting through files, connecting dots, verifying what he'd just heard. Then he turned to his son. "Son, apologize." "Now." Jake froze. The grin vanished, replaced by confusion, then a dawning embarrassment. "Dad, I was just..." "Now," Uncle John repeated, the word flat, leaving no room for argument. This wasn't a suggestion or parental irritation. This was an order delivered with the full weight of 2.5 decades of command experience. Jake's face flushed. He looked at me, then back at his father, struggling to comprehend. I didn't mean anything by it. Uncle John advanced 3 steps, closing the distance with the controlled, deliberate movement of a man exercising immense restraint. "You just disrespected a combat pilot who saved my teammates. You think that's funny?" The backyard had fallen silent. Even the children had paused their games, sensing the gravity of the moment. My mother stood frozen by the back door, a pitcher of lemonade clutched in her hands. My father, returning with the propane tank, watched from the patio's edge. Jake's mouth opened and closed. "I didn't know." "You didn't know because you didn't ask," Uncle John stated. "You assumed. You mocked. And now you will apologize." I witnessed the moment Jake's pride battled his survival instinct. His jaw tightened, his hands clenched at his sides. For a second I thought he might double down, attempt to salvage his dignity by arguing. But then he met his father's gaze and saw something that compelled him to reconsider. He turned to me, the effort etched on his face. "I'm sorry. I didn't know what you did." I nodded, accepting it. "It's fine." But it wasn't fine. Not truly. Because Uncle John wasn't finished. He remained, his focus entirely on his son. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter, yet somehow more potent. Steel Sentinel, he said, is the call sign of the pilot who flew into a hot extraction zone in Helmand province to pull out a SEAL recon team that was pinned down and taking casualties. She flew low enough that she took fire herself. She cleared the corridor long enough for the medevac to get in and extract every single man. Do you understand what that means? Jake nodded, though I sensed he didn't fully grasp it. He understood its significance, that his father revered it. But the actual reality of my actions, the calculations, the fear management, the precision required to place an aircraft exactly where it needed to be while people were actively trying to shoot you down, that was beyond his comprehension. Uncle John looked at me then, his expression softening almost imperceptibly. My unit still talks about you. They don't know your real name, but they know Steel Sentinel, the pilot who doesn't leave people behind. I felt a constriction in my throat. I'd performed that mission 3 years prior and had deliberately tried not to dwell on it. Not because it wasn't important, but because dwelling made it harder to execute the next mission and the one after that. You can't fly if you're constantly replaying every potential catastrophic outcome. I did my job, I said. You did more than that, he countered. And my son is going to remember that from now on. He turned back to Jake, a hint of sadness in his eyes. Respect, you earn it. You don't tear down someone else to build yourself up. Understood. Jake nodded, his face still flushed, his embarrassment now tinged with what looked like shame. Yes, sir. Uncle John clapped him once on the shoulder, firm but not unkind, then strode towards the cooler for another beer. The tension slowly dissipated, conversations resuming in fits and starts, everyone attempting to pretend they hadn't just witnessed something profound and uncomfortable. My father approached the grill, taking the spatula from my hand. He said nothing, simply squeezed my shoulder, that brief acknowledgement that conveyed more than words. My mother appeared at my side, placing the lemonade down, and pulled me into a quick, tight hug. Proud of you, she whispered. I nodded, not trusting my voice. Jake kept his distance for the rest of the afternoon. He spoke with Sarah, helped his mother with the food, and played with his younger cousins, but he didn't approach me. And I didn't seek him out. We both needed space to process. But as the sun began to set and people prepared to depart, I caught him watching me from across the yard. Our eyes met, and for a fleeting moment I saw something different in his expression. Not respect, not yet, but perhaps the nascent stirrings of understanding. The realization that the world was larger than he'd imagined, and that toughness manifested in forms he'd never considered. I offered a small nod, and after a hesitation he nodded back. It wasn't a reconciliation. It wasn't even a truce, really. But it was a start. The text appeared while I was deep in a staff meeting at Nellis Air Force Base, my phone buzzing silently against the conference table. I glimpsed Jake's name and mentally filed it for later. The meeting dragged on, as budget discussions always do, and by the time I returned to my office, it was nearly 5 in the afternoon. I reread his message. It was short, direct, devoid of the performative flair that once characterized his communications. Heard about your commendation. Congrats. Beer sometime. The commendation he referenced was a meritorious service medal, awarded for my leadership during a recent deployment and guiding my squadron through a complex operational cycle. It wasn't headline news, but it was recognized within military circles, and somehow the news had trickled back to my family. I typed a reply, I'm in Nevada. Next time I'm home. His response came 3 minutes later. Sounds good. Just wanted to say congrats. It took 4 more months before I returned to Virginia. A combination of scheduled leave and a conference in D.C. granted me a week on the East Coast, most of which I spent with my parents. They had aged in the 2 years since I'd moved to Nevada. Not dramatically, but noticeably. My father moved a little slower. My mother's hair was now almost entirely silver. It was a poignant reminder of time's relentless march, of the finite nature of those I loved, and the importance of making these visits count. Jake arrived on a Saturday afternoon. I was on the back porch when his truck, a newer model, work-worn but well-maintained, pulled into the driveway. He'd gained a little weight, but it looked healthy, as if he'd finally shed the burden of maintaining the gym-perfect physique that had always felt more like a performance than a preference. Hey, he called, rounding the house. Hey, I replied. We didn't hug, just offered that half-wave gesture people make when they're unsure how to greet each other. My mother had prepared a cooler filled with drinks, beer, soda, water, and Jake grabbed 2 beers, handing one to me before settling into a patio chair. For a few minutes we simply sat, sipping our drinks, observing the familiar yard. The same yard where we'd played as children, where I'd been publicly undermined at that cookout 3 years prior, where the family had gathered dozens of times for celebrations. It looked smaller now, or perhaps my own horizons had simply expanded. So, Jake began, finally breaking the comfortable silence. Squadron Commander. That's a big deal. It is, I agreed. How's it going? It's going well. Challenging but good. He nodded, taking a long pull from his beer. I looked up what that medal was for. The meritorious service one. Read about what you have to do to earn it. Wikipedia. I asked, a corner of my mouth twitching. He laughed, a short, genuine sound. Yeah, Wikipedia and some military forums. I wanted to understand. And what did you find? I prompted. He set his beer down on the table between us, carefully choosing his words. That you've been living this whole other life that none of us understood. That you're responsible for 60 people. That you've flown combat missions I can't even imagine. That you've earned respect in a world where respect actually means something. He paused. And that I spent years making jokes about paperwork. I didn't respond immediately. The truth was I'd shed most of the resentment years ago. Holding on to it demanded energy I didn't possess, and staying angry at Jake felt more like self-punishment than justice. But hearing him acknowledge it unprompted truly mattered. You didn't know, I said. I should have asked, he countered. That's what I've been thinking about. I should have just asked what you did instead of assuming. Instead of needing to be the one everyone paid attention to. A bird landed on the fence at the edge of the yard, a small, brown, unidentifiable creature. We both watched it for a moment, grateful for the brief distraction. I wanted to feel like the tough one, Jake continued. Like I had some claim to that world because of my dad. And when you actually lived it, actually did the work, it made me feel small. So I tried to make you smaller instead. He looked at me then, direct eye contact. That was cowardly. I'm sorry. You already apologized, I reminded him, referring to the cookout. That was because my dad made me, he said. This is because I actually understand now. There's a difference. I took a sip of my beer, letting that sink in. He was right. There was a difference. The first apology had been about survival, about evading his father's disapproval. This one was about growth, about genuinely recognizing his past errors and owning them. Apology accepted, I said. He nodded, and some of the tension visibly left his shoulders. Thanks. We sat in comfortable silence for a while longer, the kind of quiet that settles between people who have said what needed to be said and feel no compulsion to fill every second with chatter. So what are you doing now? I asked. Mom said you left the logistics company. Yeah, I'm working for a nonprofit now, Veteran Services. Helping guys transition back to civilian life, connecting them with resources, that kind of thing. I raised an eyebrow. That's good work. It is, he said, a note of genuine satisfaction in his voice. I'm not pretending to be something I'm not anymore. I'm not a veteran, I didn't serve. But I can still help the people who did. And it turns out I'm pretty good at it. Good at listening, at navigating bureaucracy, at connecting people with what they need. How do you find it? I asked. Dad actually, Jake replied. After he retired, he started volunteering with them. Told me they needed help and that I should check it out. I figured why not? I thought I'd volunteer for a few weeks and they ended up offering me a job. Uncle John's still pushing you in the right direction? I mused. Jake smiled. Yeah, but it's different now. He's not telling me who to be. He's just showing me options and letting me figure it out. And for the first time I feel like I'm doing something that matters, something that's mine. I knew that feeling intimately, the profound sense of ownership over your work, of building something that authentically reflects your values and capabilities, rather than someone else's expectations. I'm glad, I said genuinely. Thanks. He finished his beer and reached for another. Can I ask you something? Sure. That night in Hellman, the one my dad talks about. What was that like? I'd fielded that question countless times. From reporters, fellow pilots, people seeking a war story for cocktail parties. I usually deflected, offering minimal information to satisfy curiosity without revealing anything truly personal. But this felt different. Jake wasn't asking for a sensational tale. He was asking to understand. It was terrifying, I admitted. Every alarm in the cockpit blaring, tracers arcing up from the ground, knowing that if I miscalculated by even a few meters, I'd either miss the target or get shot down. But there were people on the ground who needed help. And I had the training and the aircraft to provide it. So I did. Just like that, he asked. Just like that, I confirmed. You don't think about being brave in the moment. You think about the calculations, the angles, the timing. The fear comes later when you're back on the ground and you realize what could have happened. Jake nodded, slowly processing. My dad talks about you to his SEAL buddies. Did you know that? No, I said, surprised. He does. They ask about family and he mentions me, but then he talks about you, about Steel Sentinel. Says you're the real deal, that you've got the kind of courage he spent his whole career trying to instill in his teams. I felt my throat tighten again. Uncle John had never spoken like that to me directly. Praise from him was typically a nod, a brief, minimalist approval. Hearing that he spoke well of me when I wasn't present hit differently. That means a lot, I said quietly. He's proud of you, Jake added. And honestly, so am I. Took me a while to get there, but I am. We finished our beers as the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the yard. My mother appeared at one point offering food, but we declined, content to simply sit and talk. We transitioned to lighter topics. His work, my squadron, family gossip, his thoughts about getting back into dating. When he finally stood to leave, we shared a real hug this time, not the awkward half gesture from earlier. He clapped me on the back and I returned the gesture. Don't be a stranger, he said. I won't. And stay safe out there. Mom worries, but so do I. I will, I promised. I watched him drive away, his truck disappearing down the street, and felt a quiet peace settle within me. This wasn't a dramatic reconciliation, no tearful moment of brotherhood magically restored. It was subtler than that, more honest. It was two people who had, intentionally and unintentionally, caused each other pain, finally finding a way to coexist with mutual respect. My father emerged onto the porch as I gathered the empty bottles. Everything okay? He asked. Yeah, I said. Everything's good. He nodded, understanding as he always did without needing lengthy explanations. He's growing up. Finally, I said. We both are. Years later, I returned home as a lieutenant colonel. Uncle John had fully retired. Jake had a family of his own. When his young son Max ran up to me and offered a crisp, earnest salute, Jake smiled. He knows who Steel Sentinel is, he said. This felt like the true resolution. Not vindication but affirmation. I had learned that authentic reputation doesn't come from constant self-explanation. It stems from lived experience. Ultimately, those whose opinions genuinely matter already discern your worth. The rest? They come around in due course. I made lieutenant colonel at 39, perfectly on track with the typical promotion timeline, yet it felt like profound validation for every effort I'd made. The promotion board had meticulously reviewed my command record, my combat hours, my leadership evaluations, and determined I was ready for the next echelon. I pinned on the silver oak leaf in a modest ceremony at Nellis, surrounded by my squadron. And for the first time in my career, my parents flew out to Nevada to witness it. My mother predictably wept tears of joy. My father stood rigid with pride, and when he shook my hand afterward, he said, "Your mother and I always knew you'd do great things. We just didn't know they'd be this great." It was the most effusive praise I'd ever heard from him, and it meant everything. Uncle John, simply John now, several years into his retirement, had sent a letter that arrived the day before the ceremony. It was handwritten, brief, in the economical prose military men specialize in. Congratulations on the promotion. You've earned every bit of it. The community knows your name now and they speak it with respect. That's the legacy that matters. John. I kept the letter in my desk drawer, occasionally pulling it out when the weight of command felt particularly heavy. Jake had married Sarah 2 years prior. She was a kind, steady teacher. They'd had a son, Max, who was 4 by the time I made lieutenant colonel. I'd met them a handful of times during brief visits home, and Sarah seemed good for Jake. Grounded, practical, patient with his occasional insecurities. She didn't demand he be anyone other than himself, a freedom that had finally allowed him to settle into his own skin. The family reunion that summer was larger than usual. Someone had rented a pavilion at a local park and aunts, uncles, cousins and various family friends I hadn't seen in years mingled under the sun. I drove up from Virginia, where I was now stationed at Langley Air Force Base as part of the Air Combat Command staff. The job was more administrative than I preferred. Less flying, more planning and policy, but it was a necessary step for senior officers, and I'd learned to find satisfaction in the strategic work, even when I missed the cockpit. I arrived mid-afternoon, still in civilian clothes, jeans and a simple button-down shirt. I'd learned years ago that wearing my uniform to family events created a barrier, making people treat me as a symbol rather than a person. It was better to simply be Cassie for a few hours, even if the rank and the work were always there just beneath the surface. Jake spotted me first. He was near the pavilion with Sarah and Max, and when he saw me, his face lit up with genuine pleasure. Cassie. We hugged, easy and comfortable now. Sarah gave me a warm smile and a hug of her own. Good to see you, Cassie. Jake talks about you all the time. Good things, I hope? I teased. Always, she assured me, her sincerity unmistakable. Max was hiding partially behind his father's leg, suddenly shy now that the stranger was actually here. He was small for 4, with Jake's dark hair and Sarah's thoughtful eyes. Jake placed a hand on his son's shoulder. Max, this is your Aunt Cassie. Remember the pilot I told you about? The boy's eyes widened. He stepped out from behind Jake's leg, suddenly less shy and more curious. You fly airplanes? I do, I said, crouching down to his level. Big ones. Fighter jets mostly. He considered this for a moment, processing. Then, with the gravity only small children can muster, he snapped a salute. Hand to forehead, earnest and slightly crooked. I felt something catch in my chest. Without thinking, I returned the salute, crisp and proper. At ease, airman. He dropped his hand, grinning. Jake was smiling too, but there was something else in his expression. Pride, perhaps, or a quiet satisfaction. He knows who Steel Sentinel is, he said softly. I straightened up, looking at Jake. You told him. I did, he affirmed. Figured he should know his aunt is pretty much a legend. I'm not, I began to protest. You are, Jake interrupted gently. And it's okay to let people know that. Especially family. Max was already moving on, his attention captured by other cousins running past. But the moment lingered between Jake and me. This was the closure I hadn't realized I needed. Not an apology, not even a direct acknowledgement of past wrongs. But this. Jake teaching his son to respect what I'd done, passing down an understanding that had taken him years to develop. Thank you, I said. He shrugged. It's just the truth. The afternoon unfolded in the easy rhythm of family gatherings. Food appeared on long tables, someone's famous potato salad, burgers and hot dogs from the grill, a sheet cake proclaiming, "Welcome home, Cassie." Even though I technically lived in Virginia now and this was just a visit. My mother had orchestrated most of it, enlisting aunts and cousins to help, resulting in the kind of abundant, slightly chaotic spread that defines family events. John Vance arrived late, walking with a slight limp that hadn't been there the last time I'd seen him. He'd undergone knee surgery, he explained when I inquired, a delayed consequence of 30 years of jumping out of perfectly good aircraft and pounding unforgiving terrain. Retirement had been otherwise kind to him. He looked relaxed, less burdened by the perpetual weight of command decisions. We found a quiet spot away from the main crowd, sitting at a picnic table while the party hummed around us. Lieutenant Colonel, he said, testing out the rank. Has a nice ring to it. Feels good, I admitted. Different but good. Command track possibly. They've mentioned it. Wing commander in a few years if things go well. He nodded approvingly. You'll be good at it. You've got the temperament. Calm under pressure, a good tactical mind, able to see the strategic picture without losing sight of the people. Learned from the best, I said. He chuckled. Don't give me too much credit. You were always going to be exactly who you are. I just made sure my son didn't get in your way permanently. We sat in comfortable silence for a moment, observing the family. Max was playing tag with a group of other children, his high-pitched laughter carrying across the park. Jake was helping at the grill, genuinely useful rather than performative. Sarah was deep in conversation with my mother and Aunt Brenda, seamlessly integrated into the family dynamic. He's doing better, John said, following my gaze to Jake. Took him longer than I would have liked, but he got there. He did, I agreed. And you never made it easy on him by being anything other than excellent, John observed. That's a gift even when it doesn't feel like one. You gave him something to measure himself against, something real instead of just my shadow. I considered that. I'd never thought about it that way. That my presence, my accomplishments, might have inadvertently helped Jake by forcing him to confront his own choices. But perhaps John was right. Perhaps we both needed each other to become the individuals we were meant to be. I'm proud of both of you, John concluded. Different paths, different struggles, but you both figured it out. As the sun began to set and people started packing up, Max ran over to me one last time. His shirt was grass-stained, his face flushed from running, but he was beaming. Will you come back again? He asked. Absolutely, I promised. And will you tell me about flying? I glanced at Jake, who nodded encouragingly. I will. Next time I'm home, we'll sit down and I'll tell you all about it. Cool. He started to run off, then turned back. Thanks for keeping people safe. It was such a simple statement, delivered with the uncomplicated sincerity only children possess, yet it struck me harder than any formal commendation or promotion ever had. This was why the work truly mattered, not for the medals or the rank, but for the people who got to go home safe, who got to raise their kids and live their lives, because someone was overhead when they needed help. You're welcome, I said, my voice a little thick. Driving back to my apartment near Langley that night, I reflected on the intricate journey that had led me here. The young woman who had joined the Air Force to prove her capabilities, who had earned her wings, her call sign, and her rank through dedication that most people could never fully grasp. The commander who had learned that true influence isn't gained through endless explanations, that respect is forged through action rather than mere words, and that the individuals who genuinely matter already acknowledge your worth. I thought about Jake, finally comfortable in his own skin, teaching his son to honor service without needing to claim it for himself. About John Vance sharing his quiet wisdom with the next generation. About my parents, proud even when they didn't entirely understand the nuances of my life. About all the pilots I'd trained, the missions I'd flown, the countless lives that had converged with mine in briefing rooms, cockpits, and combat zones. The call sign, Steel Sentinel, had defined me for years, marking me as the pilot who never abandoned those in harm's way. Yet somewhere along the path I realized I was far more than just that. I was a daughter, a cousin, a leader, a mentor. I was the culmination of every version of myself, shaped by choices and consequences, by failures and triumphs, by the silent accumulation of experiences that transformed raw potential into a profound sense of purpose. In the end, seeking vengeance had never been my aim. I never needed Jake to suffer or grovel. I simply needed him to truly see me, and crucially, I needed to stop seeking his validation to feel complete. The moment I ceased justifying my existence and began simply living my truth, everything else in its own good time found its rightful place. The ones who truly understood already knew. The rest eventually caught up. And the few who never did. Their perception held no sway over my actual work, my critical missions, or the rich, meaningful life I was deliberately building, one intentional decision at a time. It was enough. More than enough. It was, in fact, everything. What did you think of Cassie's journey? Have you ever felt the pressure to constantly prove yourself to family or friends who just didn't get what you do? Tell me about it. I really want to hear your experiences in the comments below.